Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez had been dismissed as equipment failure by her own team for 6 months. They said she lacked negotiation skills, couldn't read people, and was better suited for paperwork than field work. But when 200 hostages were trapped in the Meridian corporate tower with armed militants, and every trained negotiator had failed, Maria saw what everyone else missed. She had less than 4 hours to prove that sometimes the most unconventional approach saves the most lives. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun cast sharp geometric shadows across the concrete courtyard of the Federal Crisis Response Center, its harsh light illuminating a facility that looked more like a corporate office building than the nerve center for the nation's most critical emergency operations. Inside the main operations floor, dozens of specialists moved between workstations equipped with multiple monitors, secure communication arrays, and real-time threat assessment displays that painted the walls in shifting blue and amber light. Maria stood at the periphery of it all. Her tactical uniform crisp, but somehow less authoritative than those worn by her colleagues. Her equipment belt lighter than regulation because she'd been restricted from carrying certain standard issue items. Her notebook bound and reinforced, leather and thick with handwritten observations, rested against her hip like a badge of her outsider status. While others relied on digital interfaces and automated analysis systems, Maria documented everything by hand, cataloging behavioral patterns and environmental details that computers couldn't quantify. She carried that notebook to every briefing, every training exercise, every moment that mattered, filling its pages with observations about human behavior under stress, micro-expressions that revealed deception, and environmental factors that influence decision-making in crisis situations. No one ever asked to review her notes. No one looked through her analyses of past operations or her detailed breakdowns of what had worked and what hadn't in previous hostage scenarios. The Crisis Response Center operated on the assumption that technology and established protocols could handle any situation that arose. Teams of behavioral analysts, communication specialists, and tactical negotiators worked in carefully coordinated sequences, following procedures that had been refined through decades of successful operations. Their approach was systematic, professional, and effective in 93% of documented cases. Maria had studied that remaining 7% with obsessive attention to detail. Those failed operations shared common characteristics that didn't appear in the official after-action reports. Environmental stressors that amplified psychological pressure, cultural disconnects between negotiators and subjects, technical limitations that created communication barriers at critical moments. The patterns were subtle but consistent, visible only to someone who looked beyond the official documentation. Near the main tactical display, a cluster of senior negotiators reviewed video footage from a training exercise, their voices carrying the confidence of professionals who had successfully resolved dozens of real-world crises. Team leader Davidson, a 20-year veteran with credentials from every major law enforcement academy in the country, gestured toward the screen with practiced authority. His team had earned commendations for operations that had saved hundreds of lives through careful psychological manipulation and strategic communication. Vasquez is still obsessing over those micro-behavioral theories, Davidson said, his voice pitched loud enough for Maria to hear from across the room. Reading body language like it's some kind of mystical art form, classic academic overthinking. The comment drew chuckles from his colleagues, who had heard variations of this assessment many times before. Another negotiator, Sarah Chen, added, with a dismissive gesture, "She thinks she can solve hostage situations by analyzing hand gestures and breathing patterns. Meanwhile, we're using proven psychological frameworks and established communication protocols." The group's laughter was comfortable and familiar, the kind of casual mockery that had become routine whenever Maria's unconventional methods were Disgust. Maria had endured 6 months of these comments, watching as her detailed behavioral analyses were dismissed as pseudoscience and her observations about environmental factors were ignored in favor of standard operating procedures. The criticism wasn't malicious, but it was constant and consistent. Her colleagues had categorized her as someone who overcomplicated simple situations, who saw patterns where none existed, and who lacked the intuitive communication skills necessary for effective crisis negotiation. The label equipment failure had originated during a training exercise 3 months earlier. Maria had been assigned to assist in a simulated hostage scenario, but instead of following the established communication script, she had focused on environmental details that others considered irrelevant. She noticed that the subject's stress responses were being amplified by the acoustic properties of the training facility, that his cultural background suggested different approaches to authority and respect, and that his body language indicated specific triggers that weren't addressed in the standard psychological profile. When she attempted to incorporate these observations into the negotiation strategy, the exercise coordinator had stopped the simulation and reassigned her to technical support duties. "Vasquez, you're thinking like equipment when you should be thinking like a human being," he had said. "Stick to what you're designed for." The phrase had stuck, becoming shorthand for her tendency to approach human crises with analytical detachment, rather than emotional intuition. But Maria continued documenting everything she observed, filling her notebook with details that others dismissed as irrelevant. She recorded acoustic measurements from different facility locations, cataloged the impact of lighting conditions on stress responses, and analyzed how cultural backgrounds influenced communication preferences. Her data covered variables that didn't appear in any official training manual, factors that most negotiators never considered because they fell outside established protocols. The morning briefing began with updates on current threat assessments and training schedules. Maria took her assigned position near the back of the room, her notebook balanced on her knee as she recorded environmental details and behavioral observations that wouldn't appear in any official documentation. The room's fluorescent lighting created harsh shadows that affected how people's expressions were interpreted. The ventilation system generated background noise that could interfere with subtle vocal cues during negotiations. These details seemed trivial to others, but Maria had learned that crisis situations amplified every environmental factor. Deputy Director Walsh took the podium with the measured authority that characterized all his public presentations. His opening remarks covered standard operational updates and policy reminders, but the real focus became clear when he announced new efficiency measures for the crisis response protocols. "We're implementing streamlined procedures based on our most successful operations," Walsh began. "Technology integration will reduce response times and improve outcome predictability." The changes emphasized automated analysis systems and standardized communication frameworks. Maria's handwritten documentation and environmental assessments weren't mentioned in new protocols. Her methods, which required time and careful observation, didn't fit the streamlined approach that prioritized rapid deployment and immediate results. During the question period, Senior Negotiator Martinez asked about accommodation for non-standard scenarios that might require modified approaches. Walsh's response was immediate and definitive. "Our success rate speaks for itself. 93% effectiveness using established methods. We're not going to compromise proven procedures to accommodate theoretical alternatives." The message was clear. Maria's approach, with its emphasis on environmental factors and cultural variables, was considered theoretical rather than practical. Her detailed observations were seen as academic exercises that had no place in real-world operations, where lives depended on rapid, decisive action. As the briefing concluded, Maria closed her notebook and secured it inside her vest pocket. The familiar weight against her ribs provided small comfort in an environment that had consistently dismissed her contributions. She had learned to work within the system's constraints, documenting everything while waiting for an opportunity to prove that her methods could produce results. When conventional approaches failed, the morning light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, changing the quality of illumination in the operations center. Maria noticed the change and made a brief notation in her mental catalog of environmental variables. Most people wouldn't consider lighting conditions relevant to crisis negotiation, but Maria had observed how such factors influence psychological responses during high-stress situations. Her colleagues continued their conversations about proven methods and successful operations, their confidence built on a foundation of established procedures and documented results. Maria understood their perspective, but she also saw the gaps in their approach. The 7% failure rate represented real people, whose lives might have been saved if someone had paid attention to the details that fell outside standard protocols. The alert system activated at 2:47 p.m. with a series of sharp electronic tones that cut through the ambient noise of the crisis response center. Maria looked up from her workstation where she had been analyzing environmental data from previous operations, watching as the main tactical display immediately shifted to emergency mode. Red indicators flashed across multiple screens while automated systems began routing priority communications to designated response teams. Deputy Director Walsh's voice carried over the facility's intercom system with the controlled urgency that marked all major incident announcements. All primary response teams to stations immediately. We have a level alpha situation at Meridian Corporate Tower downtown. Multiple hostiles, approximately 200 civilians trapped on floors 15 through 25. This is not a drill. The operations floor transformed within seconds as specialized teams moved to their assigned positions. Tactical negotiators gathered around the central command station while technical analysts began establishing communication links with on-site law enforcement. Maria remained at her peripheral workstation, watching the coordinated response unfold with the detached observation that had become her default mode during major incidents. Senior negotiator Davidson took primary command of the communication protocols, his team arranging themselves around the sophisticated equipment arrays that would handle all contact with the hostage takers. The main display screens filled with building schematics, personnel manifests, and preliminary threat assessments that painted a complex picture of the crisis, developing 23 miles away in the heart of the financial district. Initial reports from first responders painted a picture that fit established patterns for domestic terrorism incidents. Armed militants had entered the Meridian Tower during the lunch hour, securing multiple floors and taking control of everyone present. Early estimates suggested 8 to 12 hostiles with automatic weapons and possible explosive devices. The building's security systems had been compromised, and all communication with the trapped civilians had been severed. Maria opened her notebook and began documenting details that others might consider irrelevant, but that her experience suggested could become significant. The incident timing mid-afternoon on a Wednesday meant the building would be at approximately 75% occupancy. The demographic composition would skew toward financial professionals and administrative staff, people with higher education levels and potentially more complex psychological profiles than average hostage populations. Weather conditions were clear, with moderate temperatures, eliminating environmental stressors that could amplify tension during extended negotiations. The building's location in the financial district meant minimal civilian foot traffic in the immediate area, reducing complications from bystanders and media presence. These factors created a relatively controlled environment for standard negotiation protocols. Assuming the hostage takers followed conventional behavioral patterns, the first communication attempt came 37 minutes after the initial alert. Davidson's team had established contact with the apparent leader of the militants, a voice that identified itself only as command, and spoke with the measured cadence that suggested military or law enforcement training. The preliminary conversation followed predictable patterns, with demands for media attention and political concessions that aligned with typical domestic terrorism scenarios. Maria listened to the audio feed through her secondary headset, documenting vocal characteristics and communication patterns that might reveal useful information about the hostage-taker's psychological state. The voice was controlled, but showed stress indicators and specific vocal frequencies. The speaker's language patterns suggested higher education and possible military background, but there were subtle inconsistencies in tone and pacing that didn't match standard profiles for ideologically motivated actors. Davidson's approach followed established protocols perfectly. He maintained calm, professional demeanor while gathering information about the hostiles' demands and the condition of the hostages. His questions were carefully structured to establish rapport and encourage dialogue, creating the foundation for extended negotiations that could eventually lead to peaceful resolution. But Maria noticed details in the communication that others seemed to miss. The hostage-taker's responses came with slight delays that suggested consultation with others, but the background audio didn't support multiple voices in the same location. The demands were politically coherent, but lacked the passionate conviction typically associated with true believers. Most significantly, the speaker occasionally used technical terminology that indicated familiarity with law enforcement procedures and negotiation tactics. During the second communication session, Maria documented additional inconsistencies that reinforced her growing suspicion that the situation didn't match standard terrorism profiles. The hostage-taker's demands escalated in complexity but remained within boundaries that experienced negotiators could reasonably address. The timeline for compliance was extended rather than compressed, suggesting someone who understood that successful negotiations required time and patience. These observations didn't align with the psychological profiles being developed by the official analysis team. Their assessment focused on ideological motivation and political grievances, assuming that extended negotiation could eventually produce acceptable compromises. Maria's notes suggested a different possibility, that the hostage-takers might be using established terrorism patterns as cover for objectives that had nothing to do with political ideology. She reviewed building schematics and financial records that were available through public databases, looking for patterns that might explain why the Meridian Tower had been selected as a target. The building housed 17 different companies ranging from investment firms to technological consultancies. But one tenant stood out as particularly significant. Meridian Financial Services occupied floors 20 through 25, exactly matching the zone where hostages were being held. Meridian Financial had been under federal investigation for money laundering and international financial crimes. Their computer systems contained records that could implicate dozens of individuals and organizations in illegal activities spanning multiple countries. If someone needed access to those systems while avoiding detection by federal monitoring programs, a hostage situation would provide perfect cover for extended on-site presence. Maria's theory suggested that the terrorism was actually an elaborate heist designed to access financial records and electronic assets that couldn't be obtained through conventional hacking methods. The hostage-takers needed time and physical access to penetrate security systems that were isolated from external networks. Creating a crisis situation would keep law enforcement focused on hostage negotiations while technical specialists worked on the real objective. The communication pattern supported this hypothesis. The hostage-taker was buying time rather than pursuing immediate political objectives. The demands were complex enough to require extended negotiations, but reasonable enough to maintain hope for peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, the extended timeline provided hours of uninterrupted access to Meridian Financial's secure computer systems. Maria documented her analysis in detailed notes, but she hesitated to present her theory to the official response team. Her previous attempts to share unconventional assessments had been dismissed as overthinking and academic speculation. Davidson and his colleagues were focused on the established protocols that had proven successful in previous operations. They wouldn't welcome suggestions that the entire situation might be different from what it appeared. The third communication session reinforced Maria's suspicions. The hostage-takers' responses became more sophisticated, demonstrating knowledge of negotiation psychology that suggested professional training. References to previous hostage situations showed familiarity with law enforcement tactics and standard resolution procedures. This wasn't someone driven by ideology or desperation. This was someone executing a carefully planned operation that used hostage negotiations as MISD, IOEC, TION. By late afternoon, Maria had accumulated substantial evidence supporting her alternative theory, but the official response continued following standard terrorism protocols. Davidson's team was making progress in establishing rapport and exploring potential compromises exactly as their training had taught them to do. Their approach was professional and competent, but it was also playing directly into the hostage-takers' strategy for maintaining extended access to the building. Maria faced a decision that would define her career and potentially affect the lives of 200 innocent people. She could continue documenting her observations while hoping that someone else would recognize the inconsistencies she had identified. Or she could risk professional censure by challenging the official assessment and presenting an alternative theory that might be dismissed as another example of her tendency to overcomplicate straightforward situations. The weight of her notebook felt heavier as she considered the implications of remaining silent. Her observations might be wrong, but they represented patterns that deserved consideration, even if they challenged established assumptions. The lives of 200 hostages might depend on someone willing to question whether the obvious explanation was actually correct. The afternoon light streaming through the operations center's windows had shifted to the golden tones that preceded sunset. Time was becoming a critical factor, but not in the way that most people assumed. If Maria's theory was correct, every hour of continued negotiations brought the real criminals closer to completing their actual mission, while law enforcement remained focused on resolving a crisis that was designed to distract from the true objective. The evening briefing convened in the main conference room with an atmosphere of controlled tension that reflected the gravity of the ongoing crisis. Senior staff members filled the chairs around the polished table, while wall-mounted displays showed real-time updates from the Meridian Tower situation. Deputy Director Walsh presided over the session with the measured authority that had guided the Crisis Response Center through dozens of similar emergencies. Davidson presented the negotiation summary with professional confidence, outlining the progress his team had made in establishing communication protocols and identifying potential areas for compromise. His assessment painted a picture of conventional domestic terrorism that aligned with established threat categories. The hostage-takers had presented coherent political demands, demonstrated willingness to engage in dialogue, and shown restraint in their treatment of civilian hostages. We're dealing with a sophisticated group, but their behavior patterns match our standard profiles for ideologically motivated actors, Davidson reported. They're seeking media attention and political concessions, following established timelines for extended negotiations. Our psychological assessment indicates they're prepared for a lengthy standoff but remain open to reasonable compromise. The briefing room nodded approvingly as Davidson outlined his team's strategy for the next phase of negotiations. They would continue building rapport while gradually introducing potential concessions that could lead to peaceful resolution. The approach was methodical and professional, based on decades of successful operations and refined through extensive training and real-world experience. Maria sat near the back of the room, her notebook closed on her lap as she listened to assessments that contradicted every observations she had documented over the past 6 hours. The official analysis focused on political motivation and ideological commitment, but her notes revealed patterns that suggested entirely different objectives. She had remained silent through the first portion of the briefing, but the weight of her alternative theory grew heavier with each passing minute. When Walsh opened the floor for additional input, Maria felt her heart rate accelerate. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, knowing that challenging the official assessment would invite skepticism and potential professional consequences. But the inconsistencies she had documented attention, even if her colleagues dismissed them as overthinking and academic speculation. "Sir, I've observed some communication patterns that might warrant consideration," Maria began, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her system. She opened her notebook and referenced the detailed observations she had accumulated throughout the day. The hostage-taker's language patterns and response timing suggest familiarity with law enforcement procedures that goes beyond typical ideological preparation. The room's attention shifted toward her with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed irritation. Davidson leaned back in his chair with the patient tolerance of someone accustomed to addressing misguided concerns from junior personnel. Other negotiators exchanged glances that conveyed their shared assessment of Maria's tendency to overcomplicate straightforward situations. "Vasquez, we appreciate your attention to detail," Walsh responded with diplomatic courtesy. "But our behavioral analysis team has conducted comprehensive psychological profiling based on established methodologies. The subject's communication style is consistent with educated domestic terrorism actors who have studied previous operations." Maria pressed forward despite the dismissive tone, reading from her notes about the timing inconsistencies and technical knowledge that suggested professional training rather than ideological motivation. She outlined her theory about Meridian Financial Services and the potential for financial crimes disguised as political terrorism. Her presentation was factual and methodical, supported by detailed documentation and logical analysis, but the response was immediate and predictable. Senior negotiator Martinez shook his head with visible frustration. "This is exactly the kind of overthinking that gets people killed in crisis situations. We're dealing with real terrorists holding real hostages, not some elaborate conspiracy theory about financial crimes." Davidson added his own assessment with professional authority. "Vasquez, you're looking for patterns that aren't there. These people have made clear political demands and demonstrated ideological commitment. We don't need to invent complex alternative explanations when the obvious one fits all available evidence." The criticism stung because it reflected months of similar dismissals. Maria's colleagues had categorized her as someone who saw conspiracies where none existed, who overcomplicated simple situations through excessive analysis and academic theorizing. Her reputation for missing the human element in crisis negotiations had followed her through multiple assignments and training exercises. "The financial investigation angle has been considered and dismissed," Walsh continued with finality. "Meridian financial systems are protected by federal monitoring protocols that would detect any unauthorized access attempts. The timing and location are coincidental, not strategic." Maria attempted to explain the technical possibilities for bypassing monitoring systems during crisis situations, but her words were met with increasing impatience from the assembled leadership. They had heard enough theoretical speculation and were focused on managing a real-world emergency that required immediate attention and decisive action. "Sergeant Vasquez," Walsh said, with the tone that indicated the discussion had concluded, "your analytical approach has value in academic settings, but this is an active hostage situation requiring proven negotiation techniques. We need to focus on established protocols rather than exploring alternative theories that lack supporting evidence." The dismissal was professional but absolute. Maria closed her notebook and acknowledged the directive with military courtesy, but her conviction about the situation's true nature had only grown stronger during the confrontation. The patterns she had identified were real and significant, regardless of whether others chose to acknowledge them. As the briefing continued with operational updates and resource allocation discussions, Maria found herself increasingly isolated from the decision-making process. Her colleagues returned their attention to conventional crisis management while she remained convinced that they were addressing the wrong problem entirely. The hostage-takers were using established terrorism patterns as cover for financial crimes that could net hundreds of millions of dollars, while law enforcement focused on negotiating political concessions. The evening shift change brought fresh personnel to the operations floor, but the strategic approach remained unchanged. Davidson's team maintained their negotiation schedule while tactical units positioned themselves for potential enforcement action. Everyone involved was competent and professional, following procedures that had proven successful in countless previous operations, but Maria continued documenting inconsistencies that reinforced her alternative theory. The hostage-takers' knowledge of building systems exceeded what political terrorists would typically possess. References to technical procedures suggested extensive preparation that went beyond ideological motivation. Most significantly, the extended timeline served financial objectives much better than it served political ones. Near midnight, Maria made a decision that would define her career and potentially affect the outcome of the crisis. She used her access credentials to review building security logs and financial transaction records that weren't part of the official investigation. The data supported her theory about sophisticated financial crimes disguised as domestic terrorism. Meridian Financial's computer systems had been experiencing unusual activity patterns that began shortly after the hostage situation commenced. Access attempts that appeared to originate from internal terminals suggested someone was using the crisis as cover for penetrating security protocols that couldn't be breached through external hacking methods. Maria documented these findings in her notebook, knowing that presenting them through official channels would result in immediate dismissal and possible disciplinary action. Her previous attempts to share unconventional analysis had been rejected, and her reputation for overthinking complex situations would ensure that any additional theories would be dismissed as academic speculation. But the evidence was becoming overwhelming. Financial transaction logs showed systematic access to accounts and records that had nothing to do with political objectives. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to transfer assets and extract sensitive information, while law enforcement remained focused on resolving what appeared to be an ideological crisis. The weight of her knowledge felt crushing as Maria considered the implications of remaining silent. 200 innocent people were being held hostage to provide cover for financial crimes that could fund future operations and compromise national security. Every hour of continued conventional negotiations brought the real criminals closer to completing their actual mission. Her colleagues were competent professionals following established procedures that had saved countless lives in previous operations. But they were also being manipulated by adversaries who understood those procedures well enough to exploit them for criminal purposes. The terrorists weren't seeking political concessions. They were buying time to complete the largest financial heist in modern history. Maria faced a choice between professional survival and moral responsibility. She could continue documenting her observations while hoping that someone else would eventually recognize the patterns she had identified. Or she could risk everything by taking unauthorized action based on a theory that her superiors had already rejected as overthinking and academic speculation. The overnight hours stretched ahead with the promise of continued negotiations and gradual progress toward peaceful resolution. But Maria's analysis suggested that peaceful resolution would come only after the criminals had achieved their real objectives and extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from accounts that law enforcement didn't even know were under attack. The Overnight hours brought a different rhythm to the Crisis Response Center, with skeleton crews maintaining essential operations while senior staff rotated through abbreviated rest periods. Maria remained at her workstation, officially assigned to monitoring duties, but secretly conducting unauthorized research into the patterns that had been haunting her analysis throughout the day. The building's ventilation system hummed with mechanical persistence, creating white noise that masked the sound of her keyboard as she accessed databases that fell outside her official clearance level. Her security credentials provided access to financial monitoring systems that most crisis response personnel never used, a legacy of her previous assignment with the Treasury Department's Cybercrime Division. Those credentials allowed her to examine transaction patterns and system access logs that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated criminal activity occurring beneath the surface of what everyone else saw as political terrorism. The data was undeniable but complex, requiring hours of careful analysis to understand the sophisticated methods being employed to transfer assets and extract sensitive information. Maria worked methodically through financial records, tracing electronic pathways that revealed systematic penetration of Meridian Financial's supposedly secure systems. The criminals weren't just accessing accounts, they were restructuring entire portfolios and rerouting funds through international networks that would make recovery nearly impossible. Each new discovery reinforced her conviction that the hostage situation was elaborate misdirection designed to provide cover for the largest financial crime in modern history. But the evidence was technical and circumstantial, difficult to explain quickly to people who were focused on immediate crisis management rather than complex financial analysis. Her previous attempts to present unconventional theories had been dismissed, and she knew that additional challenges to official assessments would be met with even greater skepticism. Senior negotiator Davidson's team continued their communication schedule with professional competence, making gradual progress in building rapport with the hostage-takers and exploring potential areas for compromise. Their approach was methodical and patient, exactly as their training had taught them to handle extended standoff situations. Every conversation followed established psychological frameworks designed to reduce tension and create opportunities for peaceful resolution. But Maria's analysis of those conversations revealed manipulation that went far beyond what political terrorists would typically employ. The hostage-taker demonstrated sophisticated understanding of negotiation psychology, using verbal techniques that suggested professional training in crisis management and behavioral manipulation. References to previous hostage situations showed familiarity with law enforcement procedures that exceeded anything found in public documentation or media coverage. During the 3 a.m. communication session, Maria documented additional inconsistencies that reinforced her theory about the situation's true nature. The hostage-takers' demands had evolved to include specific requirements for media coverage and political statements that would generate hours of additional negotiation time. Each new demand was reasonable enough to maintain hope for peaceful resolution, but complex enough to require extended discussion and careful coordination. The timing was perfect for financial criminals who needed uninterrupted access to secure computer systems. Every hour of negotiations provided additional opportunities to penetrate security protocols and transfer assets without detection. Law enforcement remained focused on resolving the hostage crisis, while hundreds of millions of dollars disappeared through electronic networks that wouldn't be discovered until the PZKV investigation shifted from crisis management to financial forensics. Maria attempted to share her concerns with the overnight supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, but received the same dismissive response that had characterized all her previous efforts to present alternative analysis. Hayes listened politely to her explanation of financial transaction patterns and system access anomalies, but ultimately deferred to the official assessment that had been established by senior personnel during the day shift. Vasquez, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we're not going to second-guess the psychological profile that's been developed by our most experienced negotiators. Hayes responded with the patient tolerance reserved for well-meaning but misguided subordinates. These people have made clear political demands and demonstrated ideological commitment. We need to focus on proven negotiation techniques rather than exploring theoretical alternatives. The rejection was professional but absolute, reflecting the institutional bias toward established procedures and conventional analysis that had shaped Maria's entire experience at the Crisis Response Center. Her colleagues trusted technology and standardized protocols more than individual observation and unconventional thinking. They had been trained to handle crises through systematic application of proven methods rather than adaptive problem-solving based on unique circumstances. But Maria's financial background provided perspectives that others lacked, allowing her to recognize patterns that had nothing to do with political terrorism or ideological motivation. The criminals were using hostage negotiations as cover for sophisticated financial crimes that required extended on-site presence and systematic access to secure computer networks. Their success depended on law enforcement maintaining focus on the apparent crisis while ignoring the real criminal activity occurring simultaneously. As dawn approached, Maria faced a decision that would define her career and potentially determine the outcome for 200 innocent hostages. She could continue working within official channels, hoping that someone else would eventually recognize the patterns she had identified and authorize appropriate investigative action. Or she could take unauthorized steps to gather definitive evidence that might prove her theory, but would certainly result in disciplinary action if she was wrong. The building's emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the operations floor as Maria reviewed her accumulated evidence one final time. Financial transaction logs showed systematic asset transfers that had begun within hours of the hostage situation's commencement. System access patterns revealed coordinated efforts to penetrate security protocols that couldn't be breached through external hacking methods. Communication analysis suggested professional knowledge of law enforcement procedures that exceeded typical terrorist preparation. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial, requiring technical expertise to understand and institutional authority to act upon. Maria possessed the expertise but lacked the authority, while her superiors possessed the authority but lacked the expertise to recognize what the data actually revealed. The institutional structure that was designed to ensure competent crisis management was also preventing recognition of criminal activity that exploited that same management system. Maria made her decision during the quiet hour before sunrise, when the overnight crew was preparing for shift change and senior personnel were still resting between negotiation sessions. She used her Treasury Department credentials to access federal financial monitoring systems and initiated unauthorized trace procedures on the account transfers she had identified. The action exceeded her current authority and violated established protocols for interagency cooperation during active crisis situations, but the results were immediate and conclusive. The trace procedures revealed coordinated money laundering operations involving dozens of international accounts and multiple financial institutions. Asset transfers were being conducted through sophisticated networks that suggested years of preparation and professional coordination. The hostage situation was providing perfect cover for criminal activity that would have been impossible to conduct under normal circumstances. Maria documented everything in her notebook, knowing that she had crossed professional boundaries that would likely end her career at the Crisis Response Center. But she had also uncovered evidence of criminal activity that dwarfed the apparent terrorism crisis in its scope and implications. Hundreds of millions of dollars were being systematically stolen while law enforcement focused on negotiating political concessions with people who had no political objectives beyond maintaining their criminal cover story. The sunrise shift change brought fresh personnel to the operations floor, including senior negotiator Davidson and his team, who would resume their patient negotiations with hostage-takers who were using every conversation to buy additional time for financial crimes. Maria remained at her workstation, officially assigned to routine monitoring duties, but secretly possessing evidence that could change the entire direction of the crisis response. Her unauthorized investigation had revealed the truth that everyone else was missing. But presenting that truth would require challenging the professional judgment of experienced personnel who had already dismissed her previous concerns as overthinking and academic speculation. She faced the choice between professional survival and moral responsibility, between following established procedures and acting on evidence that could save not just the hostages, but hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The morning light streaming through the operations center's windows illuminated a facility that was operating with professional competence and established expertise, but also with institutional blindness to criminal activity that was hidden beneath the surface of apparent political terrorism. Maria sat at the intersection of knowledge and authority, possessing evidence that could change everything, but lacking the institutional power to ensure that anyone would listen to what she had discovered. The morning briefing commenced with the same professional efficiency that had characterized every session since the crisis began. But Maria entered the conference room carrying evidence that could fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the situation. Deputy Director Walsh took his position at the head of the table, while senior staff members arranged themselves around displays showing 18 hours of negotiation progress and tactical positioning updates from the Meridian Tower perimeter. Davidson presented his overnight assessment with the confidence of someone whose methods had proven successful in dozens of previous operations. His team had maintained consistent communication with the hostage-takers, established rapport that was progressing toward meaningful dialogue, and identified several potential areas where compromise might be achieved. The psychological profile remained consistent with educated domestic terrorism actors who possessed clear political objectives and demonstrated willingness to engage in extended negotiations. "We're seeing positive indicators in their communication patterns," Davidson reported to the assembled leadership. "The subject has moved from initial demands to exploratory discussions about implementation timelines and media coordination. This suggests genuine interest in achieving their stated political objectives through negotiated settlement rather than violent confrontation." The briefing room responded with approving murmurs as Davidson outlined his strategy for the next phase of negotiations. His approach would focus on building additional trust, while gradually introducing practical considerations that could lead to face-saving compromises for all parties involved. The methodology was sophisticated and professional, based on proven psychological principles and refined through extensive, real-world experience. Maria listened to the assessment while knowing that every word reinforced criminal objectives that had nothing to do with political ideology or negotiated settlements. Her overnight investigation had revealed coordinated financial crimes that were using the extended negotiation timeline to complete asset transfers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But presenting that evidence would require challenging the professional judgment of experienced personnel who had already dismissed her concerns as academic overthinking. When Walsh opened the session for additional input, Maria felt the familiar acceleration of her heart rate that accompanied moments of professional risk. She had prepared for this confrontation throughout the early morning hours, organizing her evidence and rehearsing her presentation in ways that might overcome the institutional resistance she had encountered in previous attempts to share unconventional analysis. "Sir, I've conducted additional research into the financial aspects of this situation that I believe warrant immediate attention," Maria began, opening her notebook to pages filled with transaction data and system access logs. "The evidence suggests we may be dealing with sophisticated financial crimes disguised as political terrorism. The room's atmosphere shifted immediately as senior staff members focused their attention on Maria, with expressions that ranged from polite interest to visible irritation. Walsh's face showed the controlled patience of someone who had already addressed this topic and was prepared to do so again with greater finality. "Sergeant Vasquez, we discussed your alternative theories yesterday evening," Walsh responded with diplomatic firmness. "Our psychological assessment team has conducted comprehensive analysis based on established methodologies. The hostage-takers have demonstrated clear political motivation and ideological commitment that aligns with standard domestic terrorism profiles." Maria pressed forward despite the dismissive tone, presenting her financial transaction evidence and explaining the sophisticated money laundering operations that had been conducted under cover of the hostage situation. She outlined the systematic asset transfers, the coordinated account penetrations, and the international networks that were being used to move hundreds of millions of dollars beyond the reach of law enforcement recovery efforts. But the response was swift and decisive. Senior negotiator Martinez interrupted her presentation with visible frustration. "This is exactly the kind of conspiracy theorizing that undermines effective crisis management. We have real terrorists holding real hostages, and we're wasting valuable time exploring elaborate scenarios that have no basis in operational reality." Davidson added his own assessment with professional authority that carried the weight of 2 decades of successful negotiations. "Vasquez, you're creating complex explanations for simple situations. These people have made clear political demands and demonstrated genuine ideological commitment. We don't need to invent alternative motivations when the obvious ones fit all." Available evidence. The criticism reflected months of similar confrontations where Maria's analytical approach had been dismissed as overthinking and academic speculation. Her colleagues had categorized her as someone who missed the human element in crisis situations, who overcomplicated straightforward problems through excessive analysis and theoretical framework construction that had no practical application in real-world emergencies. The financial monitoring systems would detect any significant unauthorized access attempts. Technical Director Carson added with the certainty of someone who trusted established security protocols. Meridian Financial's computer networks are protected by federal oversight programs that provide real-time alerts for suspicious activity. Any major asset transfers would trigger immediate investigation. Maria attempted to explain how crisis situations created opportunities to bypass monitoring. Systems that couldn't distinguish between authorized emergency access and criminal penetration attempts. Her technical background provided understanding of security vulnerabilities that others lacked, but her explanations were met with increasing impatience from leadership who needed to focus on immediate, operational requirements rather than theoretical security considerations. "Sergeant Vasquez," Walsh said, with the finality that indicated the discussion had reached its conclusion, "your analytical thoroughness is appreciated, but this is an active hostage situation requiring proven crisis management techniques. We cannot afford to pursue speculative theories that distract from established protocols that have saved countless lives in previous operations." The dismissal was absolute and professional, reflecting institutional confidence in methods that had been refined through decades of successful crisis resolution. Maria's evidence was classified as theoretical speculation that lacked the practical relevance necessary for operational decision-making. Her reputation for overthinking complex situations ensured that additional challenges to official assessments would be met with even greater resistance, but Maria's conviction about the situation's true nature had been reinforced rather than diminished by the confrontation. The patterns she had identified were real and significant, supported by financial evidence that revealed criminal activity on a scale that dwarfed typical hostage situations. Every hour of continued conventional negotiations provided additional opportunities for asset transfers that would be impossible to recover once the criminal operation was completed. As the briefing concluded, with operational updates and resource allocation discussions, Maria found herself completely isolated from the decision-making process. Her colleagues returned their attention to proven crisis management techniques, while she remained convinced that they were being systematically manipulated by adversaries who understood law enforcement procedures well enough to exploit them for criminal purposes. The morning shift brought renewed energy to the negotiations as Davidson's team prepared for another day of patient dialogue and gradual progress toward potential compromise. Their professionalism was unquestionable, their methods were proven, and their commitment to saving lives was absolute. But they were also providing exactly the extended timeline that the criminals needed to complete financial operations that would net more money than most countries' annual budgets. Maria returned to her monitoring station with the knowledge that her career at the Crisis Response Center was likely finished. Her unauthorized investigation had crossed professional boundaries, and her continued challenges to official assessments had exhausted the patience of senior leadership. But she also possessed evidence that could prevent the largest financial crime in modern history if someone with authority could be convinced to act on information that contradicted established institutional assumptions. The weight of her notebook felt crushing as she documented additional transaction patterns that continued to support her theory about the situation's true nature. Financial crimes were being committed on an unprecedented scale, while law enforcement remained focused on political negotiations that served criminal rather than humanitarian objectives. 200 innocent hostages were being used as human shields for operations that would fund future criminal activities and potentially compromise national security through the theft of sensitive financial information. Maria faced the most difficult decision of her professional life. She could continue working within official channels that had repeatedly rejected her analysis, hoping that someone else would eventually recognize the patterns she had identified and authorize appropriate action. Or she could take unauthorized steps that would almost certainly end her career, but might provide the evidence necessary to expose criminal activity that was hidden beneath the surface of apparent political terrorism. The morning light streaming through the operations center's windows illuminated a facility operating with professional competence and institutional confidence, but also with systematic blindness to criminal manipulation that exploited the very procedures designed to ensure successful crisis resolution. Maria sat at the intersection of knowledge and authority, possessing truth that could change everything but lacking the institutional power to ensure that anyone would act on what she had discovered. The decision crystallized for Maria during the lunch hour when most senior staff had stepped away from active monitoring to attend a coordination meeting with federal agencies. She sat alone at her workstation, surrounded by the quiet hum of automated systems and the distant murmur of essential personnel maintaining minimal operations coverage. Her notebook lay open to pages filled with financial transaction data that painted an undeniable picture of criminal activity, but she knew that additional attempts to work through official channels would result in nothing more than formal disciplinary action. Her security clearance provided access to federal databases that most Crisis Response Center personnel never used, credentials that remained active from her previous assignment with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Those clearances had been granted for exactly this type of investigation, tracking sophisticated money laundering operations and international asset transfers that required specialized knowledge of financial crime methodologies. But using them without authorization during an active hostage situation would violate multiple protocols and potentially end her career in federal law enforcement. Maria made her choice with the methodical calculation that had characterized her entire approach to the crisis. She logged into the Treasury Department's real-time financial monitoring system, using credentials that were technically still valid but ethically questionable in this context. The system accepted her access without triggering alerts, recognizing her authorization level and assuming that her investigation had been properly coordinated with appropriate supervisory personnel, preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The financial data that appeared on her screen confirmed every suspicion she had developed over the past 24 hours. Meridian Financial Services was experiencing coordinated asset transfers that had begun within 2 hours of the hostage situation's commencement. The transactions were sophisticated and systematic, moving funds through international networks. That suggested years of preparation and professional coordination. This was an opportunistic crime. It was a meticulously planned operation that used political terrorism as cover for financial theft on an unprecedented scale. Maria documented the transaction patterns with forensic precision, creating a digital trail that could be used as evidence if anyone with authority chose to investigate further. Account numbers, routing codes, transfer amounts, and timing data painted a picture of criminal coordination that involved dozens of financial institutions across multiple countries. The money was being moved through networks that would make recovery nearly impossible once the transfers were completed. But the most disturbing discovery was the scope of the operation. Initial estimates suggested that more than $800 million had already been transferred or committed to transfer, with additional assets being systematically identified and prepared for theft. The criminals weren't just stealing from Meridian Financial's clients. They were accessing federal accounts and international reserves that posed national security implications far beyond simple financial crime. Maria printed selected portions of the transaction data, knowing that digital evidence could be dismissed as fabricated or misinterpreted, but that physical documentation would be harder to ignore if she could present it to the right person. The printer operated with mechanical precision, producing pages of financial records that proved criminal activity was occurring, while law enforcement remained focused on political negotiations. Her unauthorized investigation was interrupted by footsteps in the corridor outside the operations center. Maria quickly closed the Treasury Department database and secured the printed evidence inside her notebook, returning her workstation to routine monitoring displays just as Lieutenant Commander Hayes entered the room. His expression was professional, but curious, suggesting that he had noticed something unusual about her activities during the lunch break. "Vasquez, what are you working on during the break period?" Hayes asked with the casual interest that often preceded more serious inquiries. "Your workstation showed elevated network activity that seemed inconsistent with routine monitoring duties." Maria responded with careful truth that avoided direct deception while protecting her unauthorized investigation. "I've been reviewing financial background information related to the Meridian Tower tenants, sir. Trying to understand if there might be additional factors that could influence the hostage-takers' motivations or objectives." Hayes nodded with the patient tolerance that characterized his interactions with personnel who demonstrated excessive thoroughness in their assignments. "Vasquez, I appreciate your dedication, but we need to maintain focus on proven crisis management techniques rather than exploring theoretical alternatives. The negotiation team has established effective communication protocols that are progressing toward potential resolution." The response was predictable but frustrating. Maria's evidence was being dismissed before it could even be presented, classified as theoretical exploration rather than practical investigation. But she had learned to work within institutional constraints, preserving her findings while appearing to comply with official directives. "Understood, sir," Maria replied with military courtesy. "I'll maintain focus on current monitoring requirements and standard operational procedures." Hayes accepted her acknowledgement and moved on to other duties, leaving Maria alone with evidence that could change the entire direction of the crisis response, but no official avenue for presenting it to decision-makers. Her unauthorized investigation had crossed professional boundaries that would result in serious consequences if discovered. But it had also revealed criminal activity that demanded immediate action from someone with authority to coordinate appropriate law enforcement response. The afternoon hours brought renewed activity to the operations center as senior staff returned from their coordination meetings with updates on federal agency involvement and media management strategies. Davidson's negotiation team prepared for another session of patient dialogue with hostage takers who were using every conversation to buy additional time for financial crimes that would be nearly impossible to prosecute once the assets disappeared into international networks. Maria remained at her monitoring station, officially assigned to routine surveillance duties, but secretly possessing evidence that could expose the largest financial crime in modern history. The weight of her knowledge felt overwhelming as she watched competent professionals follow established procedures that were being systematically exploited by adversaries who understood those procedures well enough to manipulate them for criminal purposes. During the 2 p.m. communication session, Maria listened to negotiations that confirmed her analysis of the situation's true nature. The hostage takers' demands had evolved to include specific requirements for international media coverage and coordinated political statements that would require additional hours of discussion and careful preparation. Each new demand was reasonable, enough to maintain hope for peaceful resolution, but complex enough to justify extended negotiations that served criminal rather than political objectives. The conversation patterns revealed sophisticated understanding of crisis psychology and negotiation tactics that exceeded anything found in public documentation or media coverage. References to previous hostage situations demonstrated familiarity with law enforcement procedures that suggested professional training or inside knowledge of federal crisis management protocols. This wasn't ideological terrorism, it was criminal theater designed to provide cover for financial theft. But Maria's colleagues remained focused on the apparent crisis rather than the hidden criminal activity. Their training and experience had prepared them to handle political terrorism through patient negotiation and gradual compromise, but they lacked the financial expertise to recognize sophisticated money laundering operations that were being conducted simultaneously with the hostage situation. As the afternoon progressed, Maria faced an impossible choice between professional survival and moral responsibility. She could continue working within official channels that had repeatedly rejected her analysis, hoping that someone else would eventually recognize the patterns she had identified. Or she could take additional unauthorized action that would almost certainly end her career, but might provide the evidence necessary to expose criminal activity that threatened national security as well as individual financial victims. The evidence in her notebook represented hours of unauthorized investigation that had violated multiple protocols and potentially compromised her security clearance. But it also documented criminal activity on a scale that dwarfed typical hostage situations, revealing coordinated theft that would fund future operations and potentially compromise sensitive financial information with national security implications. Maria made her second unauthorized decision during the shift change period when personnel transitions created brief gaps in supervisory oversight. She used her Treasury Department credentials to access international financial monitoring networks and initiated trace procedures on the asset transfers she had identified. The action exceeded her current authority and violated established protocols for interagency cooperation, but it provided definitive evidence of criminal coordination that involved financial institutions across multiple countries. The results were immediate and conclusive. The trace procedures revealed systematic money laundering operations that had been planned months in advance, with the hostage situation serving as predetermined cover for criminal activity that required extended on-site access to secure computer networks. The operation involved dozens of international accounts and multiple criminal organizations working in coordination to steal assets and sensitive information that posed national security risks far beyond simple financial crime. Maria documented everything with forensic precision, knowing that she had gathered evidence that could prevent unprecedented financial theft, but had also destroyed her career at the Crisis Response Center. Her unauthorized investigation had crossed professional boundaries that would result in disciplinary action and potential criminal charges, but it had also revealed truth that could save not just the hostages, but hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets and sensitive information with national security implications. The critical moment arrived at 4:17 p.m. when Maria's financial monitoring systems detected the activation of final transfer protocols that would complete the criminals' asset theft within the next 2 hours. Her unauthorized trace procedures had revealed that the hostage situation was entering its terminal phase, not because negotiations were approaching resolution, but because the financial crimes were nearing completion. Once the final transfers were executed, the stolen assets would disappear into international networks that would make recovery virtually impossible. Maria faced the starkest choice of her professional life. She could continue documenting criminal activity while hoping that someone else would eventually recognize the patterns she had identified, or she could take direct action that would violate every protocol she had ever sworn to uphold. The evidence in her notebook proved that 200 innocent hostages were being used as human shields for the largest financial crime in modern history. But that evidence was worthless unless someone with authority acted on it immediately. Her security credentials provided access to emergency communication protocols that could bypass normal supervisory channels and connect directly to federal agencies with jurisdiction over financial crimes. But using those protocols without authorization during an active hostage situation would constitute insubordination that could result in criminal charges and immediate termination from federal service. Maria had spent her entire career building professional credibility that would be destroyed if she was wrong about the situation's true nature. But the financial data streaming across her workstation left no room for doubt. Asset transfers were accelerating according to predetermined schedules that suggested the criminals were preparing to conclude their operation and eliminate the hostage situation that had provided cover for their activities. The negotiation timeline that Davidson's team saw as gradual progress toward peaceful resolution was actually a countdown timer for completing financial theft that would fund terrorist operations for decades. Maria initiated the emergency communication protocol at 4:23 p.m., using her Treasury Department credentials to establish direct contact with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's Crisis Response Coordinator. The connection bypassed all local supervisory channels and triggered automatic alerts at multiple federal agencies, creating an electronic paper trail that would document her unauthorized action for subsequent disciplinary proceedings. "This is Agent Sarah Chun at FinCEN Emergency Response," came the immediate reply. "You're calling out emergency protocols. State your situation and authorization." Maria identified herself and provided her Treasury credentials, knowing that the conversation was being recorded and would be used as evidence in whatever disciplinary action followed. Her unauthorized contact with federal agencies. "I'm reporting active financial crimes in progress at the Meridian Tower hostage situation. Asset transfers exceeding $800 million are being conducted under cover of terrorism that appears to be misdirection for sophisticated money laundering operations." The response was immediate and professional. Agent Chun requested detailed information about the financial activity Maria had identified, and Maria provided account numbers, transfer codes, and timing data that painted a comprehensive picture of coordinated criminal activity. The evidence was technical and complex, but Chun possessed the expertise necessary to understand the implications of what Maria was reporting. "Agent Vasquez, the transaction patterns you're describing would require extensive preparation and professional coordination," Chun replied after reviewing the initial data. Are you certain that this financial activity is connected to the hostage situation rather than coincidental criminal operations? Maria explained the timing correlations, communication patterns, and technical access requirements that proved the financial crimes were being conducted by the same individuals who were engaged in hostage negotiations. The criminals needed extended on-site presence to penetrate security systems that couldn't be accessed through external hacking methods, and they were using political terrorism as cover to maintain that presence while law enforcement focused on crisis management rather than financial investigation. But even as Maria provided evidence that proved her theory, she could hear activity in the corridor outside the operations center that suggested her unauthorized communication had been detected by local security systems. Footsteps approached with the measured urgency that characterized response to potential security violations, and Maria knew that her career at the Crisis Response Center was ending regardless of whether her information proved accurate. Deputy Director Walsh entered the operations center accompanied by Lieutenant Commander Hayes and 2 security personnel whose presence indicated that Maria's activities had triggered formal investigation procedures. Their expressions were controlled but serious, reflecting institutional concern about unauthorized contact with external agencies during active crisis operations. Sergeant Vasquez, you need to terminate that communication immediately and report to the conference room for debriefing, Walsh commanded with the authority that brooked no discussion. Your unauthorized use of external communication protocols during an active operation constitutes a serious violation of established security procedures. Maria acknowledged the directive, but requested permission to complete her evidence transfer to Agent Chun, knowing that the financial data she had collected would be lost if the investigation was terminated before federal agencies could take appropriate action. Sir, I've identified financial crimes in progress that require immediate federal intervention. The evidence needs to be preserved and acted upon before the assets are transferred beyond recovery. Walsh's response was immediate and definitive. Sergeant Vasquez, you will terminate that communication now and surrender all materials related to your unauthorized investigation. Your theories about financial crimes have been reviewed and dismissed by qualified personnel. You are not authorized to contact external agencies based on speculative analysis that contradicts official assessments. The confrontation represented everything Maria had experienced throughout her assignment to the Crisis Response Center. Institutional authority trumped individual analysis. Established procedures took precedence over unconventional evidence, and professional hierarchy prevented recognition of criminal activity that exploited the very systems designed to ensure effective crisis management. But Maria had prepared for this moment throughout her unauthorized investigation. Before Walsh could prevent her from completing the evidence transfer, she transmitted her complete financial analysis to Agent Chun, along with account access codes and transaction schedules that would allow federal investigators to trace the criminal operations independently. The data transfer was completed in seconds, creating a permanent record of her findings in federal databases that local authorities couldn't suppress or modify. Evidence transfer complete, Maria reported to both Walsh and Agent Chun simultaneously. Federal investigators now have access to all financial data related to the coordinated money laundering operations being conducted under cover of the hostage situation. Walsh's expression shifted from controlled irritation to genuine alarm as he realized that Maria's unauthorized investigation had involved federal agencies that possessed independent authority to investigate financial crimes regardless of local crisis management priorities. The situation had moved beyond internal disciplinary action to potential interagency conflict over operational jurisdiction and investigative priorities. Agent Chun's voice came through the communication channel with professional authority that carried federal law enforcement weight. Deputy Director Walsh, this is Agent Chin at FinCEN. We've received credible evidence of major financial crimes in progress that require immediate investigation. We're initiating federal asset protection protocols and requesting coordination with your crisis management operations. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Federal involvement changed the entire dynamic of the situation, bringing financial crime expertise and investigative authority that local crisis management personnel couldn't dismiss or override. Maria's unauthorized action had created facts on the ground that forced recognition of criminal activity that had been hidden beneath the surface of apparent political terrorism. But the personal cost was equally immediate. Walsh's expression made clear that Maria's career at the Crisis Response Center was finished, regardless of whether her evidence proved accurate. Her violation of established protocols and unauthorized contact with external agencies constituted insubordination that would result in formal disciplinary action and potential criminal charges for exceeding her authority during an active crisis operation. Security personnel moved closer to Maria's workstation, their presence indicating that she was being placed under administrative custody, pending formal investigation of her unauthorized activities. The weight of her notebook felt heavier as she realized that her quest to expose financial crimes had destroyed her professional future, while potentially saving hundreds of millions of dollars and 200 innocent lives. The Operations Center buzzed with activity as federal agencies began coordinating with local crisis management to address financial crimes that had been previously unknown to anyone except Maria. Her unauthorized investigation had forced institutional recognition of criminal activity that threatened national security as well as individual victims. But it had also ended her career in federal law enforcement through violations of protocol that couldn't be overlooked regardless of the ultimate accuracy of her analysis. Maria surrendered her security credentials and submitted to administrative custody with the quiet dignity that had characterized her entire approach to professional challenges. She had proven that sometimes the most important discoveries required violation of established procedures, but she had also learned that institutional systems punished unconventional thinking even when it produced results that conventional methods couldn't achieve. The federal coordination that followed Maria's evidence transfer transformed the Crisis Response Center into something unprecedented, facility managing both hostage negotiations and a massive financial crime investigation simultaneously. Agent Chun arrived within 45 minutes, accompanied by a team of FinCEN specialists who possessed the technical expertise necessary to trace the sophisticated money laundering operations that Maria had identified. Their presence created immediate tension with local crisis management personnel, who viewed federal intervention as unnecessary complication of established procedures. Deputy Director Walsh found himself managing competing priorities that pulled the operation in fundamentally different directions. Davidson's negotiation team required continued focus on political dialogue and gradual compromise to maintain progress toward peaceful hostage resolution. But federal investigators needed immediate action to prevent asset transfers that would complete financial crimes already in progress. The two objectives were incompatible, creating institutional conflict that threatened both missions. Maria remained in administrative custody in a conference room adjacent to the main operations center, her security credentials suspended and her access to communication systems terminated. But through the room's observation window, she could see the controlled chaos that her unauthorized investigation had triggered. Federal agents worked at hastily established workstations, while crisis management personnel struggled to integrate financial crime priorities with hostage negotiation requirements. Agent Chun presented her preliminary analysis to the assembled leadership with the authority that came from federal jurisdiction over financial crimes. The evidence that Maria had provided revealed coordinated asset transfers involving multiple international banks and criminal organizations that had been planned months in advance. The hostage situation was providing perfect cover for financial theft that would net more than $1 billion once the final transfers were completed. The transaction patterns show systematic penetration of Federal Reserve accounts and international monetary funds, Chun reported to the stunned leadership. This isn't simple bank robbery disguised as terrorism. These people are stealing government assets and classified financial information that could compromise national security for decades. The scope of the criminal operation exceeded anything in previous federal case files. The hostage-takers weren't just accessing Meridian Financial's client accounts. They were using the company's federal connections to penetrate Treasury Department systems and international monetary networks that controlled global financial stability. The theft included classified information about government financial operations that could be used to destabilize entire economies. Davidson's reaction was immediate and defensive. Agent Chun, we've been conducting professional negotiations with these people for over 24 hours. Their demands are clearly political, and their behavior patterns match established domestic terrorism profiles. We can't abandon proven crisis management techniques based on theoretical financial speculation. But Chung's response carried federal authority that couldn't be dismissed through local institutional hierarchy. Senior negotiator Davidson, the financial evidence is conclusive and immediate. Asset transfers are scheduled for completion within 90 minutes. Once those transfers are executed, we'll be dealing with the largest financial crime in history while the perpetrators eliminate witnesses and disappear through predetermined escape routes. The confrontation represented institutional conflict between crisis management and criminal investigation that had no established resolution procedures. Davidson's team possessed expertise in hostage psychology and negotiation tactics, but they lacked understanding of sophisticated financial crimes that exploited their very methods. Federal investigators understood the criminal operations, but had limited experience with hostage situations that involved innocent civilian lives. Maria watched the debate through the observation window, knowing that her evidence had created the crisis but lacking authority to influence its resolution. Her unauthorized investigation had forced recognition of criminal activity that threatened national security, but it had also destroyed institutional confidence in crisis management, procedures that had been refined through decades of successful operations. The breakthrough came when Agent Chun's technical team completed their analysis of the financial networks that Maria had identified. The investigation revealed that the hostage-takers possessed inside knowledge of federal crisis management protocols that suggested coordination with individuals who had extensive law enforcement training. Their negotiation tactics weren't just sophisticated, they were specifically designed to exploit established procedures while maintaining criminal operations. The communication patterns show familiarity with federal negotiation psychology that exceeds public information. Chun reported, "These people understand crisis management protocols because they've been trained in them. We're dealing with law enforcement personnel who have turned criminal and are using their professional knowledge to exploit the very systems designed to save lives." The revelation transformed everyone's understanding of the situation. The hostage-takers weren't ideologically motivated terrorists who could be reasoned with through political compromise. They were criminal professionals who understood exactly how law enforcement would respond, and had planned their operation to exploit those responses while completing financial theft that would fund future criminal activities. But the recognition of criminal manipulation created new challenges for resolving the hostage situation. Davidson's negotiation techniques had been developed for dealing with people who possessed genuine political motivations and could be influenced through psychological appeal and rational compromise. Criminal professionals who were using hostages as human shields for financial theft required completely different approaches that prioritized tactical intervention over patient dialogue. Walsh faced the most difficult decision of his career as competing federal agencies demanded priority for their respective missions. The FBI's hostage rescue team wanted immediate tactical action to prevent elimination of witnesses who could testify about financial crimes. FINCEN investigators needed continued access to monitor asset transfers and trace criminal networks. Local crisis management personnel insisted that proven negotiation techniques could still achieve peaceful resolution if given adequate time. The debate was resolved when Maria's financial monitoring systems detected acceleration of the final transfer protocols. The criminals were preparing to conclude their operation ahead of schedule, suggesting that they had detected federal investigation and were moving to complete asset theft before law enforcement could prevent the transfers. Time had become the critical factor that would determine whether 200 hostages lived or died. Agent Chun requested immediate access to Maria for consultation about the financial systems that were being exploited by the criminals. Despite her administrative custody and suspended security clearance, Maria possessed technical knowledge that federal investigators needed to understand the sophisticated networks being used for asset transfers. Her unauthorized investigation had made her the only person who fully understood how the criminal operation was being conducted. "Sergeant Vasquez, we need your expertise to trace the final transfer protocols," Chun said as Maria was escorted into the main operations center under security supervision. "The financial networks they're using require someone with your background to understand the technical vulnerabilities they're exploiting." Maria returned to her workstation under federal authority that superseded local disciplinary action. Her notebook was returned along with access credentials that allowed her to demonstrate the sophisticated methods being used to steal government assets and classified information. The evidence she had collected through unauthorized investigation became critical intelligence for preventing financial crimes that threatened national security. Working directly with federal investigators, Maria traced the criminal networks that connected the hostage situation to international money laundering operations involving terrorist financing and government corruption. The scope of the investigation revealed criminal coordination that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, implicating individuals and organizations that had been using sophisticated financial crimes to fund destabilizing activities around the world. But the most critical discovery was the timeline for completing asset transfers. Maria's analysis revealed that the criminals planned to conclude their operation within 60 minutes, after which they would eliminate the hostages and escape through predetermined routes that had been established months in advance. The negotiation timeline that Davidson's team had seen as gradual progress was actually a countdown to mass murder designed to eliminate witnesses who could identify the perpetrators. The revelation forced immediate tactical intervention despite the risks to hostage safety. Federal agencies coordinated with local law enforcement to initiate assault procedures that prioritize stopping asset transfers and preventing witness elimination. The operation required precise timing to save both the hostages and the stolen assets that were being systematically transferred to international criminal networks. Maria's unauthorized investigation had revealed truth that saved 200 innocent lives and prevented financial crimes that would have funded terrorist operations for decades. But her violation of established protocols had also destroyed institutional confidence in procedures that had been developed to ensure effective crisis management through professional coordination and systematic application of proven methods. Personal cost of her unauthorized action would be determined through formal disciplinary proceedings that could result in criminal charges and permanent exclusion from federal law enforcement. But the immediate result was tactical intervention that saved lives and prevented financial crimes that threatened national security. Through systematic theft of government assets and classified information, the tactical assault commenced at precisely 6:34 p.m. with coordinated entry through multiple breach points that had been identified through Maria's detailed analysis of the building's security vulnerabilities. Federal agents moved to the Meridian Tower with precision that reflected Months of preparation by criminals who had studied every aspect of the facility's layout and security systems. But Maria's unauthorized investigation had provided law enforcement with intelligence about criminal tactics that allowed them to anticipate and counter strategies that would have otherwise ensured successful escape. The operation unfolded with mechanical efficiency as specialized teams secured floor-by-floor control while financial crime investigators simultaneously shut down asset transfer protocols that were in their final stages of execution. Maria remained at her workstation in the Crisis Response Center, monitoring financial networks in real time while providing technical guidance to federal agents who were encountering sophisticated security systems that required her expertise to penetrate and disable. Her notebook had become an operational manual for understanding criminal techniques that exploited vulnerabilities in both physical security and electronic financial networks. Every detail she had documented through unauthorized investigation proved critical for preventing asset transfers and identifying criminal personnel who had planned to disappear through predetermined escape routes once their financial theft was completed. The first breakthrough came when federal agents discovered the technical operations center that criminals had established on the 22nd floor of Meridian Tower. The facility contained sophisticated computer equipment and communication systems that confirmed Maria's analysis of the situation as elaborate cover for financial crimes rather than political terrorism. But the discovery also revealed the true scope of criminal coordination that extended far beyond simple money laundering into systematic penetration of government financial systems. Agent Chun's voice came through the communication channel with urgent updates that validated every aspect of Maria's unauthorized investigation. "We found the criminal nerve center. They've been accessing Federal Reserve systems and international monetary networks through Meridian Financial's authorized connections. The equipment here could have destabilized global financial markets if they'd had another hour to complete their operations." The hostages were discovered in secured conference rooms where they had been held as human shields rather than victims of political terrorism. Their testimony revealed that the criminals had made no political statements or ideological demands during the entire 26-hour operation. Instead, they had focused entirely on technical activities that involved accessing computer systems and conducting complex financial transactions that required uninterrupted concentration and systematic coordination. Maria's analysis of criminal psychology had been proven accurate through direct witness testimony. The hostage takers possessed extensive law enforcement training and had used their professional knowledge to exploit crisis management protocols while conducting financial crimes. Their negotiation tactics had been specifically designed to buy time rather than achieve political objectives, creating extended access to secure systems that couldn't be penetrated through external hacking methods. But the most significant discovery was the criminal network's true scope. Federal agents found evidence of coordination with international terrorist organizations and government corruption that involved dozens of countries and criminal enterprises. The Meridian Tower operation was one component of a global financial crime syndicate that had been systematically stealing government assets and classified information to fund destabilizing activities around the world. Deputy Director Walsh received regular updates from federal agents who were securing evidence that proved the accuracy of Maria's unauthorized investigation while revealing criminal activities that exceeded anything in previous case files. The scope of the operation required coordination between multiple federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations to trace criminal networks and recover stolen assets that had been distributed through sophisticated money laundering systems. "The evidence recovery is unprecedented," Walsh reported to senior leadership through secure communication channels. "We're looking at financial crimes that involve government assets, classified information, and international criminal coordination that could have compromised national security for decades." Sergeant Vasquez's Investigation identified patterns that prevented catastrophic theft and potential economic destabilization. The acknowledgement represented institutional recognition that Maria's unauthorized methods had produced results that conventional crisis management couldn't have achieved. Her violation of established protocols had saved not just 200 innocent lives but potentially prevented financial crimes that would have funded terrorist operations and government corruption on a global scale, but the personal cost remained severe despite the successful outcome. Maria's unauthorized investigation had crossed professional boundaries that couldn't be overlooked regardless of the ultimate accuracy of her analysis. Federal agencies praised her technical expertise and investigative competence, but local institutional authority demanded accountability for protocol violations that had undermined established crisis management procedures. The disciplinary hearing convened the following morning with senior leadership from multiple agencies who needed to balance recognition of exceptional results with enforcement of professional standards that ensured institutional credibility. Maria appeared before the assembled officials with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her approach to every professional challenge, carrying her notebook as evidence of the systematic documentation that had made her unauthorized investigation possible. Admiral Morrison, who had been summoned from the Naval Crisis Response Center to provide perspective on Maria's background and professional competence, spoke with authority that carried weight throughout the federal law enforcement community. Sergeant Vasquez's methods were unconventional and unauthorized, but her results prevented financial crimes that would have threatened national security while saving 200 innocent lives. Her technical expertise and investigative persistence identified patterns that established procedures had missed. The hearing room listened to testimony from federal agents who described how Maria's evidence had been critical for understanding criminal tactics and preventing asset transfers that were in their final stages of execution. Agent Chun provided detailed analysis of the sophisticated financial networks that Maria had identified through unauthorized investigation, emphasizing that conventional crisis management wouldn't have detected the criminal activities until after the theft was completed. Without Sergeant Vasquez's financial analysis, we would have successfully negotiated release of the hostages while remaining completely unaware that we had facilitated the largest financial crime in history, Chun testified. Her violation of protocols saved government assets and classified information that could have been used to destabilize global financial markets. But institutional representatives emphasized that unauthorized action during crisis situations created precedents that could undermine professional coordination and systematic application of proven methods. Military discipline required adherence to established procedures regardless of individual judgment or alternative analysis that might produce superior results through unconventional approaches. The tension between individual competence and institutional authority represented fundamental questions about how organizations balanced innovation with accountability, expertise with hierarchy, and results with procedures. Maria's case became a test of whether federal law enforcement could adapt to recognize unconventional thinking while maintaining professional standards that ensured coordinated response to complex emergencies. The resolution came through compromise that acknowledged both the exceptional nature of Maria's results and the necessity of maintaining institutional discipline. Her unauthorized investigation was classified as emergency action that had been justified by subsequent events, but her violation of established protocols required formal reprimand and reassignment to duties that better utilized her financial crime expertise while preventing future unauthorized actions. Deputy Director Walsh announced the decision with the measured authority that characterized all official pronouncements about personnel actions with institutional implications. Sergeant Vasquez demonstrated exceptional technical competence and investigative persistence that prevented major financial crimes and saved innocent lives. Her methods violated established protocols, but her results justify classification as emergency action that contributed to national security objectives. The compromise satisfied no one completely but provided institutional resolution that recognized exceptional results while maintaining professional standards. Maria accepted reassignment to the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement network, where her expertise would be utilized for authorized investigations rather than unauthorized crisis interventions. Her career at the Crisis Response Center was concluded, but her professional future was preserved through recognition of competence that had produced unprecedented results. Federal agencies implemented new protocols that integrated financial crime analysis with crisis management to prevent exploitation of institutional procedures by criminal organizations with professional law enforcement training. Maria's investigative techniques were incorporated into standard training curricula for personnel who might encounter similar situations where conventional approaches proved inadequate for addressing sophisticated criminal operations. The institutional changes represented acknowledgement that conventional crisis management required adaptation to address criminal threats that exploited established procedures while conducting activities that fell outside traditional terrorism profiles. Maria's unauthorized investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in federal law enforcement coordination that needed systematic correction to prevent future exploitation by criminal organizations with professional expertise. Her notebook was classified as evidence in ongoing investigations that traced criminal networks across multiple countries and organizations. The documentation she had compiled through unauthorized methods became critical intelligence for understanding how sophisticated criminal operations exploited institutional procedures while conducting financial crimes that threatened national security through systematic theft of government assets and classified information. Maria's transition to federal financial crime investigation represented professional recognition that her expertise was valuable when properly channeled through authorized procedures. Her experience with unauthorized investigation had taught her the importance of working within institutional frameworks while maintaining the analytical persistence that had made her discoveries possible. 18 months after the Meridian Tower operation, Maria stood before a classroom of federal agents at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network training facility, watching as her students worked through case studies that had become standard curriculum for identifying sophisticated criminal operations disguised as conventional terrorism. The morning light streamed through large windows that overlooked the Potomac River, illuminating a facility that had been transformed by lessons learned from her unauthorized investigation and its unprecedented results. Her position as senior financial crime analyst represented institutional recognition that her expertise was valuable when properly channeled through authorized procedures. The classroom where she taught contained displays showing financial transaction patterns and criminal network analysis that had once been dismissed as academic overthinking, but were now considered essential knowledge for federal law enforcement personnel who might encounter similar situations. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez raised her hand with a question about anomaly detection in crisis situations. "Ma'am, how do you distinguish between legitimate emergency financial activity and coordinated criminal operations when the patterns can appear similar during the initial phases of investigation?" The question reflected the sophisticated understanding that Maria's training programs had developed among federal personnel who had learned to recognize criminal tactics that exploited established law enforcement procedures. Her students possessed technical knowledge that would have prevented the institutional blindness that had initially dismissed her analysis of the Meridian Tower situation as theoretical speculation rather than practical intelligence. You document everything systematically and look for patterns that exceed normal crisis response parameters, Maria replied, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Criminal operations require coordination and preparation that leaves traces in financial networks, communication patterns, and timing sequences that can be detected if you know what indicators to examine. The lesson continued with practical exercises that taught students to identify sophisticated money laundering operations and international asset transfer networks that used crisis situations as cover for criminal activities. Maria's teaching methodology emphasized systematic documentation and patient analysis rather than immediate conclusions, training federal personnel to recognize subtle patterns that conventional crisis management might overlook. During the break period, Maria received a secure message through the facility's communication system, requesting her presence in Deputy Director Walsh's office for a priority consultation. The text was brief and formal, but the security classification suggested involvement in current operations rather than routine administrative matters. She secured her teaching materials and made her way through the building's corridors toward the senior leadership section. Walsh's office had been reconfigured since Maria's disciplinary hearing, with additional workstations and communication equipment that reflected expanded coordination between crisis management and financial crime investigation. The changes represented institutional adaptation that had resulted from lessons learned during the Meridian Tower operation and subsequent analysis of criminal tactics that exploited gaps in federal law enforcement coordination. Maria, we have a situation developing that requires your specific expertise, Walsh began without preliminary discussion. There's been a coordinated attack on multiple financial institutions across 3 states, with hostage situations at each location. Initial analysis suggests political terrorism, but the patterns are triggering alerts and systems that were developed based on your Meridian Tower investigation. The briefing materials displayed on Walsh's monitors showed incident reports from simultaneous operations that had begun within minutes of each other, involving financial institutions that possess specific federal connections and international transaction capabilities. The coordination and timing suggested preparation that exceeded typical domestic terrorism capabilities, indicating potential involvement of criminal organizations with sophisticated planning and professional expertise. Maria reviewed the preliminary data with the analytical methodology that had become second nature through months of teaching federal personnel to recognize criminal patterns in crisis situations. The geographic distribution of targets created access to regional Federal Reserve systems and international monetary networks that would be required for large-scale asset transfers. The timing coincided with peak transaction periods that would provide cover for unauthorized financial activities. The institutional targets suggest systematic preparation rather than opportunistic terrorism, Maria observed, referencing financial network maps that showed connections between the targeted locations. If this follows the Meridian Tower pattern, we should be seeing coordinated asset transfer activities that began shortly after the hostage situations commenced. Walsh nodded with the grim recognition that had characterized his approach to crisis situations, since learning how conventional procedures could be exploited by criminal organizations with professional training. His experience during the Meridian Tower operation had taught him to consider alternative explanations when crisis patterns suggested coordination that exceeded typical terrorist capabilities. The FBI's crisis response teams are implementing standard hostage negotiation protocols at each location, but we need financial crime analysis to determine whether these situations involve criminal operations disguised as political terrorism. Walsh continued, "Your expertise could be critical for identifying patterns that conventional crisis management might miss." The request represented institutional recognition that Maria's unconventional analysis methods had value when properly integrated with established procedures rather than conducted through unauthorized investigation. Federal agencies had learned to balance individual expertise with institutional coordination, creating frameworks that utilized her analytical capabilities while maintaining professional accountability and systematic crisis management. Maria accepted the assignment with the understanding that her role would be advisory rather than operational, providing financial crime analysis to support crisis management decisions rather than conducting independent investigation that might conflict with established procedures. Her experience with unauthorized action had taught her the importance of working within institutional frameworks while maintaining the analytical persistence that made her discoveries possible. The Federal Coordination Center had been transformed since the Meridian Tower operation, with integrated workstations that allowed real-time collaboration between crisis management and financial crime investigation. The changes reflected systematic adaptation to address criminal threats that exploited gaps in federal law enforcement coordination, creating capabilities that could detect sophisticated operations that used conventional terrorism as cover for financial crimes. Maria's analysis station provided access to financial monitoring systems and criminal network databases that had been developed based on evidence recovered from the Meridian Tower investigation. The sophisticated tools allowed her to trace asset transfers and communication patterns in real time while providing immediate intelligence to crisis management teams, who could incorporate financial crime considerations into their negotiation strategies. The preliminary investigation confirmed Maria's assessment that the coordinated attacks were providing cover for sophisticated financial crimes that involved systematic penetration of federal systems and international monetary networks. Asset transfers had begun at each location within hours of the hostage situations, following patterns that matched criminal tactics identified during the Meridian Tower operation. But the current situation was more complex than the previous crisis, involving multiple locations and criminal coordination that suggested involvement of international networks with extensive resources and professional planning capabilities. The scale of the operation required coordination between multiple federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations to address criminal activities that threaten global financial stability. Maria's role in the coordinated response represented institutional recognition that her expertise was valuable when properly utilized through authorized procedures and systematic coordination with established crisis management protocols. Her unauthorized investigation had taught important lessons about balancing individual competence with institutional authority, creating frameworks that utilized unconventional thinking while maintaining professional accountability. The successful resolution of the coordinated financial crimes demonstrated that federal law enforcement had learned to adapt to sophisticated criminal threats that exploited conventional procedures while conducting activities that fell outside traditional terrorism. Profiles. Maria's analytical methods had been incorporated into standard protocols that allowed early detection of criminal operations disguised as political crises. Her career transformation from unauthorized investigator to authorized trainer represented institutional adaptation that balanced innovation with accountability, expertise with hierarchy, and results with procedures. The federal system had learned to recognize unconventional thinking while maintaining professional standards that ensured coordinated response to complex emergencies that required both crisis management and financial crime investigation. The quiet satisfaction that Maria felt as she returned to her teaching duties reflected personal growth that had emerged from professional challenges. Her unauthorized investigation had violated established protocols, but had also prevented financial crimes that threatened national security while saving innocent lives. The institutional recognition of her expertise validated years of patient analysis and systematic documentation that had been dismissed as academic overthinking. The students in her classroom represented the next generation of federal personnel who would learn from the beginning that crisis situations could involve sophisticated criminal operations that required integrated analysis of both human psychology and financial networks. Maria's teaching ensured that future investigations would benefit from analytical methods that had been proven through real-world application rather than theoretical speculation. Her notebook which had once contained unauthorized evidence that threatened her career, now provided curriculum, material for training programs that taught federal personnel to recognize patterns that conventional procedures might overlook. The documentation she had compiled through violations of protocol had become institutionalized knowledge that would prevent future exploitation of crisis management procedures by criminal organizations with professional expertise. The transformation was complete but subtle, reflecting institutional adaptation that had emerged from individual courage and persistence, rather than dramatic confrontation. Maria had proven that some victories happened through patient accumulation of expertise that eventually became impossible to ignore, creating changes that served both individual recognition and institutional improvement. The legacy of her unauthorized investigation would continue through federal personnel, who learned to balance systematic procedures with analytical innovation, creating capabilities that could address sophisticated threats while maintaining professional coordination and accountability. Her story had become an institutional memory that validated the importance of recognizing unconventional thinking while ensuring that innovation served rather than undermined established procedures designed to protect innocent lives and national security. The evening sun cast long shadows across the training facility as Maria packed her teaching materials, reflecting on a journey that had transformed institutional blindness into systematic vigilance. Her students filed out discussing case studies that had once been dismissed as impossible scenarios, now understanding that the most dangerous threats often hid behind familiar patterns. News alert flashed across her phone. International financial crime network dismantled using revolutionary detection methods. The article credited federal agencies with preventing over $3 billion in theft across 17 countries, all traced back to techniques developed from the Meridian Tower investigation. Maria smiled quietly, knowing that 200 hostages had been just the beginning. Her notebook, now digitized and incorporated into federal training databases, had evolved from personal documentation into institutional knowledge that protected millions of people from criminal operations they would never know existed. The quiet vigilance that had once isolated her had become the foundation for a new generation of federal personnel who understood that the most important discoveries often emerged from patterns that others preferred to dismiss. The weight of recognition felt different from the weight of isolation, but Maria carried both with the same understated professionalism that had defined her approach to every challenge. She had learned that true strength moved in silence, guided by the conviction that doing the right thing rarely began with applause, but always ended with results that spoke louder than any words could express. The quiet heroes among us prove that persistence conquers skepticism, expertise overcomes bureaucracy, and one person's courage to see what others miss can save countless lives. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks through actions rather than arguments. If you found Maria's story inspiring, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their expertise matters, even when others don't listen. Drop a comment below telling us about a time you trusted your instincts despite opposition. We read every single one. What other untold stories of quiet courage should we explore next? Let us know, and remember, the most important victories often happen in silence.